Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever the fluff you are in the world. And welcome to the show. Neil Pickup here, the fat lad in the mother fluffing house, and let me tell you now, as I come to you live on this Tuesday evening here in the UK, it is blisteringly hot. If I look like I'm sweating, it's not because I've stolen anything. It's just that fat men do not do well in humidity and heat. And at the moment, I'm sweating like a greased up chip. Anyway, enough of the niceties. Let me introduce the show. Let me introduce you who I've got on. We are starting a new monthly chat show. Okay, maybe even bi-weekly chat show. The concept here, guys, right? For all of you who are new to the channel, most of arm wrestling right now tends to revolve around the here and the now. It's the World Arm Wrestling League. It's the Professional Arm Wrestling League's top 8. It's the superstars of the sport now. But what about way back? What about back when the sport was in its infancy? Before there was a sport? How did it all begin? Where did it come from? That's the kind of thing that we want to talk about on this show. Mother Fluffers, welcome to the old school. And who's joined me on this chat? Well, if you're going to do a chat called Old School, you need somebody that is old school. And I've got a couple of them on here. Let me introduce the first one. This guy needs no introduction anywhere in the world of refereeing. Because if you're taking a shovel load of shit from the front row, it's very likely that this is the mother fluffer who's throwing it at you. He is a former multiple national US champion, multiple Masters champion of the world, Mr. Bob Brown in the house. Bob, welcome to the show.
Hello. I'm the guy that's always corrected Bart every time he's fucked up and made a wrong call.
Right.
Now then, that brings me to the next person that is on this call. He will be known to many of you as the man with the hardest job in arm wrestling. He's the guy that wears the stripes for the World Arm Wrestling League. This guy isn't just a referee. He's a multiple... In fact, this guy's a much more decorated arm wrestler than probably any of you realise. He came from the sport of iron arms and progressed into refereeing. He's got a very, very difficult job. He takes fire from all sides, but don't ever underestimate that this man has massive knowledge and experience in the sport. Ladies and gents, Bart Wood is in the mother fluffing house. Bart, welcome to the show, dude.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
You look like you've been hanging out with Mark Yellow. You are tanned up.
Outside all the time.
Looks good.
Thanks, fellas. Just outside and training with that quarantine, you know, a lot of time off work. And my boy, he's getting ready for football season, so we're training all the time. But I'm getting a lot of arm wrestling training in, too, because I'm blessed to have all these arm wrestlers, like, just within minutes of my house. I have Tom Taylor. It's about 30 seconds from my house. I got Dave Chafee, James Wagner, John Hajnowski, and the list goes on and on. So I make my rounds.
Great place to be, mate, and real honour to have yourself and Bob on the show. The last member of this team may be the most important person on this call, bar none. Ladies and gents, for those of you who don't know the man I'm about to introduce you to, he is the creator of what I consider to be the best source of arm wrestling historical reference available on the planet. He is a very, very solid arm wrestler, right-handed, left-handed, a member of the Ottawa High Hookers crew. This guy's been pulling for years at a very high level amongst Murderer's Row of talent in Canada. He set about bringing together all the knowledge, all the facts from the sport of arm wrestling and putting it into one place so that fans of the sport can go out there and enjoy it. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Eric Roussin. Mate, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Neil. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm loving the beard. I mean, yeah. You know,
first time
where'd that come?
It's the time to do it, so.
Yeah. You used to look like a professional arm wrestler. Now you look like you grow plants. It's a good look. You know, it's like, next one, he's done the archive. Next one, it'll be plants around the world and the history of how they grow. Mate, joking aside, thanks for coming on the show. Absolutely super excited to get this show underway. And in some respects, Eric, before we get things nailed down and before we start talking about some of the stuff, I wanted to just check with yourself for my own purposes and for the people out there. Why? Why did you get into the archives? I mean, give us a little bit of history of why you went down and dug into the history of the sport.
So about 10 years ago, I had already been in the sport since 96. That's when I started. And it would frustrate me that I would hear people say that they've won 26 world titles, 30 world titles, and I couldn't find any evidence of it online. Not to say that I believed it was a lie, but I wanted to know where these titles came from, who won what. And there was very, very little from the pre-internet days. There was almost nothing online. Mm-hmm. So, my initial, goal was to unearth the results from, the World's Wrist Wrestling Championship in Petaluma. Because I knew that event had been going on for a long time. And I also knew that Bill Sobranis he wrote for the newspaper, so I was sure that the event was covered. At that time, did some research. The newspaper was only available on microfiche or microfilm at the Petaluma Library. And I knew I was not going to be able to get to Petaluma anytime soon, so I contacted the library. I said, listen, can you put me in touch with someone who's going to do research? I'll pay them for their time. And so I paid someone to go through the newspapers and I found all the results. So that was my big first find. I put that all online. I wrote an article about it. Cause I had spoke to many people. I had spoke to Dave DeVota, but for details as to who won what when, really you had to go back to the source. So once I did that for the World's Wrist Wrestling Championship, and then I decided, let's see if I can figure out and learn about all the other organizations that were around, back in the 90s, 80s, 70s, and even earlier. So because it didn't exist and I was interested, I figured, hey, if somebody's got to do it, I might as well try and do it myself. So,
starting point, start up at 10. Just tell people the full title of the website, mate. Where can people go to check out this remarkable bit of work that you've done?
It's the Armwrestlingarchives.com. The Armwrestlingarchives.com. And from there, everything's pretty much organized by decade, so it's fairly easy to navigate. But results, event histories, who the top pullers were, stuff like that.
Really is an absolutely remarkable source. It really is, mate. Sorry, Bob, you were going in there, mate.
Oh, I was just going to say it's a truly amazing source. My hat off to Eric for doing this. It was absolutely, I didn't think it could be done, and he's done it. It's just unbelievable.
Thanks a lot. Initially, my plan was this was going to be a summer project 10 years ago, and I thought, I don't know, maybe I'll write a book. But I decided eventually that as I dug, I just wanted to dig more, and a website allows me to just keep updating gradually. And rather than sell a book that maybe 100 people will buy, if it's online, a lot more people can learn about it for free. So really my goal is just to share the knowledge. So that's why I do it on the website.
Wow. And how many hours or how much time have you actually put into it now, Rick?
Over 10 years, I don't know. It's,
oh my word.
Thousands of hours, but spread over 10 years. So it's not I go through phases where I'm very, very active in researching and writing, but then I won't do anything for a few weeks. So thousands and thousands and thousands of hours.
Wow.
That's remarkable.
It's a passion because it's something that I think I'm the only one doing and I really enjoy it. So if you like it, it doesn't seem like work. So.
And you've had so much contribution from other people that you've spoken to, so much fact, so much point, so many things, and so much knowledge in that one.
Yeah, I've probably spoken either officially, like an official interview, or probably maybe 100 people, key people. I've including yourself 10 years ago. I don't know if you remember. I interviewed you.
I do remember it very well. I remember it very well.
And then I've looked through all the arm benders, any newsletter that I can get my hands on. I've done research. Now it's a lot easier to do research because most of the newspapers have been digitized. So you can find them on sites like newspaper.com, or there are sources. You have to pay for them, but it's a lot easier to research in the past 3-4 years than it has been before. But my goal was also to interview these people before they disappear, right? The people who were leading the organizations in the 70s, they are now in their 70s and 80s. So I figured in the past 10 years was the time to talk to them because, before they're gone forever.
Remarkable. And God bless you for doing it, because what a fantastic source. Guys, let's get into let's get into some of the stuff here. So, obviously, if you're new to the sport, you may not know that the history of arm wrestling dates back to ancient times. And when we're talking, and this is documented on the site, obviously, Eric, we're talking about Egyptian times, Roman, yeah?
Egyptian, that particular idea's floated around for a long time, but I have not found proof of arm wrestling. There's a close-up of a hieroglyphic on one of the tombs. But if you back it up, it's clearly part of a dance. Like there's a series of pictures.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying it wasn't practiced in Egypt, but I don't think there's proof that it has. I think there's definitely proof that it's been in existence in Japan for several hundred years, in Hawaii for several hundred years, even in Quebec, in French Canada, at least to the 1700s for sure. That's documented. Mm-hmm. And like I said, it may have been in Greece, in ancient Rome, likely was. I just haven't been able to prove it. So I prefer to focus on what I can actually find, proof of.
No,
it's been happening for thousands of years. There's no doubt that the practice has been around for a long time.
I thought it was really cool, some of the articles that you gave us today to look at, where it showed like the pictures, the Japanese pictures back in 1763 of them locked up and actually pulling.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty remarkable. And that's as clear as you can see that, that was going on back then.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating.
My theory is it independently evolved in many different parts of the world. And, it only started getting sort of together in the 20th century with the organizations coming together. But I don't think it originated in one single place and then spread from there. I think it probably evolved in different areas.
Mm-hmm. So for the purpose of the show and for the purpose of the discussions that we're going to have on here, and also, guys, as I say in a lot of the shows, if you're coming on this and you like the content here on the Supernatural Strength channel, you like what we're doing here in Old School, and you've got questions, things that you want to pose to any member of the crew here, particularly Eric, because obviously he's a wealth of knowledge in this area, please send your questions in. Put them in the comments, send them independently, PM them to one of the guys. We will pick those up and we'll address them. But for the purpose of the show, what we wanted to do was try to start really at the birth of organised arm wrestling, or the first instances of arm wrestling being covered. Arm wrestling as a pastime, a sport, a distraction, something that the media were picking up on so that it was becoming something that people were talking about and it was gaining popularity. And we asked Eric to pick out a couple of little gems of what he wanted to do. Eric, where do you want to start, brother?
Well, the definition that you just described to me, what I found the earliest has been in the Montreal area, Montreal, Canada, at the turn of the 20th century. The sport started to be covered. It was challenge matches. One person came from the countryside in 1898 and he said, "I'm a good arm wrestler." The sport or the practice had existed for a long time, but he was willing to bet, I think, $100 back in those days that he could beat anyone 2 out of 3. And the guy who came to the city actually won, and it was covered in the newspaper, and challenge matches emerged from there. So it was super match arm wrestling in the way we consider it. Most of them were 2 out of 3s, 3 out of 5s between 2 people with money bet on the outcome. So it wasn't tournaments. It was challenge matches.
That's quite interesting, Eric, because up to very recently, I genuinely consider myself the originator of super match arm wrestling. That's true.
Well, you probably
talk about your old-time backfires. Clearly not the case. Only guy who could have actually achieved that and had it legitimately verified would probably be Pascal Girard, due to the fact that he'd have been only a couple of 100 years old at that time.
Right. So they would get together and they'd nitpick about all the same things that arm wrestlers do now. They'd have to agree on who the ref would be, where the match would be held, on what table. The table was just a standard table, but what they would argue is that the matches would be settled on elbow placement would be anywhere between 12 inches between the elbows up to 18 inches. Obviously, with the elbows closer together, it would more favor a hook puller because you could get inside more, versus where it's 18 inches apart, it's more of an outside game. And I found newspaper articles where they actually talk about the different moves, talk about these rules. So it was quite surprising me to learn this. One of the first guys who was a legitimate badass was Hector DeCarry. Hector DeCarry is a strongman from the time of Louis Cyr, and he's actually the person who took Louis' title. They met in a strongman contest in 1906. Louis Cyr was declining health. Hector DeCarry was the rising star, and actually tied. Louis, in normal circumstances, would have kicked his ass but he was in those last few years of life. But he felt, listen, you tied me. I haven't lost my title, but I will bestow it to you. And so he was the reigning strongman of that time, at least in Canada. And he was also the arm wrestling champion because he defeated the guy who was sort of undefeated back in 1901. So Hector DeCarry was sort of one of the first superstars of arm wrestling, I guess, in Montreal. And he was also a legit strongman. A few years later, there's a guy by the name of Théophile Massé. He, only weighing about 190 pounds, he remained undefeated in super matches for 11 years in Canada. 11 years, in which he'd probably do about 100 matches, all for money. And what's interesting is he wanted to pull Hector so bad, but Hector, he basically won the title and never arm wrestled again. And then he would bug him. I want to arm wrestle. I want to arm wrestle. I want to be recognized as the legitimate, champion of Canada. Hector would say, there's not enough money involved. I don't want to train just for arm wrestling. I'm already making money doing strongman. Eventually, he finally agrees, I think in 1921. He says, all right, I'll do it for $500, which is the equivalent of about $5,000 today. Mm-hmm. We have to do it, I think, 12 inches apart. And there was a time limit. Basically, if you did not pin the guy within 30 seconds, it would be declared a draw. And then you grip up again until there's a winner.
Wow.
I think the time limit for those ones were 15 seconds. Hector knew he was a strong, fast inside puller. Théophile was more of different techniques, but he wasn't necessarily known for his speed. But just to make the match happen, he agreed to all of Hector's terms, and it backfired. That's where he lost the title that he held for 11 years. Hector beat him 2 out of 3, and then Hector never arm wrestled again. He just got the title again, and so that's what happened. He regretted having. He says, had I stuck to my guns and actually required a fair setup or fair things that were more in balance, he thought he would have won, but that's how it goes sometimes.
So he manipulated the way the match happened to favor himself. That sounds like lots of arm wrestling.
It's an early descendant of Travis Page.
I wasn't going to say the name. I'm glad you did.
Mate, every credit to the guy. If he ain't cheating, he ain't trying.
If you look at those old newspaper articles, you'll see trash talking. People would write to the newspaper. Open letters.
This is Travis Page.
Open letters saying,
Travis.
calling people out, calling them cowards, it's like the early days of trash talking. It existed 100 years ago.
Oh yeah, and everyone's still a crybaby today.
Yeah.
Now, any evidence here or anything mentioned around equipment, style, seated, standing?
So the mat there, it was seated. Mm-hmm. It was a table. There wasn't much to the table. There were sometimes little grooves in which they placed the elbows, but there wasn't. And there was usually a straight line between the elbows to measure the distance. Aside from that, there was occasionally the use of a strap. I found a record of 1925 where all the matches started in a strap. Wow. So strap goes back a long way.
Remarkable.
But the table was not standardized by any sense. It wasn't. That died down sort of around in the early 1930s in Montreal. It fell, I guess, strongman as well fell out of favor, so it stopped being covered. Presumably, it continued to some degree. But then I think the next superstar that people heard about was Mac Batchelor out of California. So he owned a bar in California, and he was also a strongman. And he was famous or known for arm wrestling anyone who wanted. And between 1931 and 1956, it's said that he never lost a match, whether seated, standing, sit down, wrist wrestling, arm wrestling, any style. Apparently, he never lost a match. And he became sort of known because he would write articles for some of the muscle magazines of the era. So and he was a strongman. So he developed that reputation, undefeated for 25 years. He never actually competed in an arm wrestling tournament, but he was one of the first stars of the sport.
Remarkable. You know, one thing I wanted to pick up on that you said a second ago,
Yeah.
And we will come back to Mac in a second, but you said about the straps. So when was the earliest evidence of the straps?
Yeah.
The one that I found the earliest is 1925, earliest reference.
So 1925.
Exactly.
That would suggest the top roll technique in some form was alive in 1925.
On the outside setup that Eric was talking about, most likely.
It would suggest back pressure was around in some form. Unless the only thing I could think of is if there was some kind of PR aesthetic angle to the use of a strap outside, outside of that.
Right.
I think it was out of necessity. The three techniques I saw described in 1905 were the hook, and they call it a hook in French, crochet's hook. The half hook, which I'm guessing is, somewhere in between a flat wrist and a hook, and the straight pull. The straight pull, I think, is probably more of an outside move. I don't have the details of the proof, but that's my interpretation.
It sounds like it's just pulling straight back.
Right.
So, Eric, did you get a chance to, I saw in one of the articles, the Molding a Mighty Grip 1930, that was the first source of like the rules and stuff. Did they have it written in there about the strap back then?
No, they didn't mention the strap at all.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if when they were referring to a straight match, a hook, a half hook, and a straight match, if they just simply meant your wrist had to stay straight, which when your wrist stays straight, even if you go pure side pressure, hands can slip apart. You'd only need a little bit of back pressure for hands to then come apart, So I find that very interesting, that back in 1925, they had this problem.
And the three moves were presented as techniques, so it's not necessarily that they had matches that had a certain hook or half hook or straight, but they were just three different techniques that they identified.
Gotcha. Yeah. Wow.
Absolutely. But no other reference to standardized equipment, standardized pads, just the distance, the 12 inches and 18 inches.
Right. Or anywhere in between. They'd agree. So if you want to do 15 inches or if you want to do 16 and a half, that was negotiated between the competitors ahead of time.
Well, what I found interesting when I was reading these earlier today is back then there was no peg. You just simply put your non-competing arm just flat on the tabletop. You didn't hold on to anything with it. It just sat there. And then I did find it very interesting that you pointed out, Eric, that a lot of people used 15 inches apart, which is the exact distance we still use today. Center pad to center elbow pad to center elbow pad, it's exactly 15 inches.
I noticed that. Yeah, it's an interesting coincidence.
And I'm wondering if, back then people just put their elbows down in just however they put their elbow down on the table, and they measured how far apart they are. And then you're right, everyone looks for their advantage. Probably somebody realized, hey, if our elbows are closer together, I seem to do better. And someone else said, hey, if my elbows are farther apart, I seem to do better. And, people just argued over it because they knew it gave them a little bit of an advantage.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah, so in every sport, in every pastime, there's often things within there that it's just, okay, how did that come about? Well, we don't know. I mean, I worked in the wine industry, and in the UK and most places around the world, the standardized size of the glass is 75 centilitre. Always struck me as strange. Why 75 centilitre? And apparently it's purely and simply just that was the average lung capacity on people that would blow the glass. Something as basic as that. And yet, you know, if it ain't broke. So,
Right.
you know, the origins of these things, it's often fascinating how you've arrived there. Let's get back to Mac Batchelor. What do we know about this guy, Eric?
So he was a character, I know that. He was not shy to demonstrate his strength. He was known for, he was strong overall, but he was particularly known for his hand strength. He could put bottle caps in between his 5 fingers and make a fist and crush all 4 bottle caps at the same time. I thought it was cool, if not at least painful.
Incredible.
He was a very, very strong guy. He's known for having, one night apparently in the 1940s, the entire roster of the Los Angeles Rams, I think, football team, they went to try to beat him, and one after another he beat them all. So that's a cool little story.
I love some of these old tests of strength. You know, like we had a thing called, when I got into arm wrestling, there was a guy on the wall of a local pub, you know, and Bill Hunt was the guy's name, and there was all kinds of tests of strength. One of them was called the Max Alding chair, and it was like a huge wooden throne, and you had to pick it up from one leg. Anybody who could pick up the chair from one leg of the chair.
Wow.
Just things like that, you know. The legend has it that in Blackburn there was a guy called Strong Dick who could bend iron bars around his penis up to his late 70s. Obviously, in his late 70s, he had to retire. His wrists went.
Well,
Not sure about the legend of Strong Dick, but the Max Alding chair, ever so real. And there's various, in all strength sports, there's various sort of, you know, the old pool cues between the fingers and lifting them up. They're all over the world. And I think probably around the origins of arm wrestling, I think myth and legend would have played quite a big part, wouldn't it? Because there was no internet.
Yep.
yeah.
So these stories, you know, the campfire stories, there is this one guy. And it's how it gets about, and it's great. It's like ghost story time, isn't it? Tell us something about someone who can do something amazing, you know.
I'm always thankful that I started arm wrestling before the internet, because now I can still, the older I get, the better I was, and there's no proof that I'm wrong. It's the beauty.
Eric is working diligently on proving all this stuff. Absolutely wonderful. So, Mac Batchelor, what was his sort of... Sorry, Eric, you were going to make a point there, I think.
I was just going to add something about Mac Batchelor. There is one event that sort of added legitimacy to his title, his self-declared title. In 1946, there was a match arranged in Los Angeles to crown the wrist wrestling champion of the world. Mm-hmm. It was between him and a shot putter by the name of Earl Odette, who was a very strong guy. Apparently, he was a very good arm wrestler. And they did have a 2 out of 3 match with official rule as a referee at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. So that he won that. So that's at least a legitimate, under official settings. He was a very good arm wrestler.
How big was he, mate?
He was about 6 feet tall, 330. So big for those days.
Because looking at the pictures on the site, he looks like sort of like Farm Boy Strong, that blacksmith look, doesn't he?
Yeah.
You know, and God knows there's been some extremely powerful guy with that kind of physique, particularly back in the day. You know, the guy that everybody knows, that one guy whose wrists are abnormally thick. You don't necessarily need to be as muscular. Guys like, I'm talking about people like Farid Usmanov.
Yeah.
You know, Farid Usmanov would show up at a competition, or Ferit Osmanli as he's known now, and he'd show up at a competition. He may not have been muscular, but he walked past you and you were like, Jesus.
Yeah.
He was just so, just a thick, rugged son of a bitch, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Unbelievably powerful man. And you could just see it. You know, looked like he could chew his way through bamboo. Jaw. Unbelievably strong. So, after the year of Mac Batchelor, mate, let's move into sort of more Unless you've got other people that you wanted to focus on, because there were some fascinating characters that you sent through. I mean, the Japanese guy that you sent through the picture of, the sort of most ancient of shots. What a character that is! Yeah. He is like the living embodiment of Popeye the Sailor Man.
Yeah, it's a great picture. Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, he's like Sparrow. There's nothing about him physically, and then he's just got massive forearm development.
Yeah, he got things, so he was born around 1900 and formed the first Japanese association around 1928. And that's more, armed sumo as Devin, has talked about before. So your elbow moves freely around the table, and you don't necessarily have to pin service, your opponent. You can just hold him to the side. So there's much more like freedom arm wrestling. Yeah. But he arm wrestled, his whole life. Like there's a video circulating on YouTube where he's in his 90s and he's apparently, I don't know how legit it is, he's beating, young 20-year-olds who weigh 250 pounds. I don't know if it's true, but that's at least how it's presented. Wow. He lived to the age of 102. So arm wrestling maybe is a good case for longevity.
Well, one thing you can say is if you look at the sort of physicality of that guy, he is, he's built for the sport, isn't he? He's got all his weight in his forearms.
Yep. He's a specimen. Tetsu Yamamoto is his name.
Truly remarkable. I mean, there's been freaks throughout history, and there still is. We look at some of the modern day ones, but you'd have to say this is not a guy that you'd imagine is going to be chemically enhanced.
No.
I was once told when you look at the size of a gentleman's wrist and you see how thick it is, you can compare it to the tendons being like cables on a crane. And the heavier the cables are, which means the bigger the wrist is and the joint, the bigger those tendons are going to be. The bigger the cables for a crane, the more weight it can hold and move. So that correlation is so true to the human body. When you see these guys with these huge elbow joints and just huge, thick wrists, their tendons are like damn cables off a crane. And the strength capacity is so much more than your average human being.
Absolutely.
The other thing I noticed there is looking at some of the pictures of the guys that you sent through. There were definitely a sprinkling of that sort of circus strongman look, where they've got some development in the upper body, not impressive by modern standards, but we're sort of pre-chemical enhancement here. So these are obviously guys that are very focused on fitness and strength and obviously have some genetic potential without a doubt.
Yeah.
Of all the guys you've studied back in the day, the earliest people, is there any, are there a number of people that stand out as being physically abnormal? Is there anybody that you would say was specifically designed or gifted for the sport outside of the Japanese fellow that we just spoke about? Today we've got people like Oleg Soik, Matthias Slitter, Anybody of that?
I mean, not to that degree. I don't know if you've seen pictures of Arthur Danduran, he was one of the top arm wrestlers in Montreal at the turn of the century, and he was a physical specimen. Like if you look at pictures of him, he does not look like strongman at that time. He looks like a bodybuilder. So he stands out, and he was a very good arm wrestler and strongman.
Very big man or not?
No, not a very big man, 185 pounds, 5'9", 5'10", but you'd be happy to look like him right now. Like he looked good. He looked good. Physical specimens, not really. I think the one you pointed out, the Japanese, Tetsu Yamamoto, he's the one, you see that picture and you're like, wow.
Yeah. You really are. You're like, what the? Yeah, I mean, forearms on and no development anywhere else in his body.
No.
I mean, his body's actually thin to the point where it looks like he's undernourished. I mean, if that guy had been born today, you'd think he was like addicted to Pornhub and his glasses would be 8 inches thick. I mean, he's got enormous forearms and zero muscle anywhere else on his body. It's ridiculous. But, I mean, from what you're saying, he arm wrestled till he was in his 90s? Wow.
Yeah.
Just remarkable.
In terms of other specimens, not any that jump to mind, but I would say there's a nice transition from Mac Batchelor to the early days of Petaluma. So Mac Batchelor, at some point when he was younger, he actually lived in Petaluma. His dad owned an insurance business. And so Bill Sobranis got heard of this, and he's like, well, there's a Jack Hommel. He was a trainer for the Detroit Tigers when he spent the off season near Petaluma, and he would go to the bar and talk about how he was unbeaten in arm wrestling, and he would take anyone, wrist wrestling they would call it. And so Bill Sobranis tried to see if Mac Batchelor would want to make a trip and have a match. At that point, Mac was in his later years, and he wasn't interested in traveling, and I don't think they had the money to put out to make it worth his while. So they arranged another match between a local farmer who was also supposedly had never lost. So Jack Hommel and Oliver Kohlberg they had their initial challenge match at Gilardi's Bar in Petaluma, and that's the match that started the whole thing. That was just a single match. Apparently it ended in a draw. After 3 minutes, the table fell apart. Some of that, I don't know how much of that's true or how much of that is legend, but that is the match that kicked everything off. Basically, there were a few people in attendance, but Bill Sobranis wrote it up in his column, and they decided to, from that point, have a little tournament every year. And the tournament grew and grew and grew. It used to be just the Petaluma, then Northern California Championships, then California Championships, and in the early 60s, they started calling it the World Wrestling Championships, and that's what really started to get momentum going for organized arm wrestling.
Is that when they started interlocking their non-competing hand?
So they did that from the start. I don't know what the origin is of that, but that's how Jack Hommel arm wrestled. And because he was involved from the start, they sort of went with what he knew. So they did it hand interlocking, and they called it wrist wrestling. But I don't know exactly where that hand interlocking came from. I'm not sure, because they didn't do that in Montreal and in many of the other historically, like in Hawaii, they would do it bent over on the ground, but their non-competing hands sort of like behind their back. So the hand clasped in the middle, I'm not too sure about the origin of that one. But that's what wrist wrestling was. In California, they called that wrist wrestling, so wrist wrestling became synonymous with the clasping of the non-competing hand.
Absolutely incredible. So,
wow.
Let's get on to organised competitions, mate, and open tournament. So away from challenge matches, when did we start to see organised competitions and tournaments for the sport?
So it's probably happened. I found evidence of tournaments held here or there over the years, but Petaluma is really the first one that became annual, and it grew and grew. So I sort of attribute it, at least in North America, as Petaluma being the first. So they had an annual tournament. The first year, I think they only had 7 or 8 entries. Mm-hmm. Single open weight class, single elimination. Turnout grew and grew and grew. By the early 60s, they were getting 50 or 60 people, and people were coming from definitely out of town and starting to come out from out of state. It was still just a single open weight class, single elimination, unseeded. So you can imagine. In fact, most of the early leagues up, through the 60s and 70s, with the exception of WAF and AAA, most events were single elimination. So can you imagine going to an unseeded tournament, single elimination? I don't know. I don't think I'd do it.
Yeah.
I've got to say I would do it. I've done it. I've been to single elimination tournaments back in the day, but, as the sport's progressed, it makes, I've never been to a single elimination open weight one class event in my life.
I think 64 is when they added the 200-pound weight class. So at least they had 2 classes, or maybe in 62. But anyway, around that time, by the mid-60s, they actually came up with the 3rd class. So at that point, they had lightweight 175 and under, middleweight was 200, open weight was above 200, and they added a women's open class as well. So that became the standard for wrist wrestling for the next 10 years.
And that was in around 1962.
62 was the first time they called it the World Championships.
Okay.
1969 was the first event that was covered by ABC's Wide World of Sports. Mm-hmm. And that was broadcast in early 1970. And that is the kickoff point for everything that came after. as soon as they aired that in 1970, basically think of anyone who joined the sport in the 70s, and they could trace it back to the coverage of Petaluma. So had that,
awesome.
we can thank Dave Devoto. He's the one who negotiated that first deal with ABC, and we have him to thank for that. Because if that hadn't happened, who knows where arm wrestling would be. But everything. I'm talking about Bob O'Leary. I'm talking Steve Simons, WPAA. I'm talking all of the organizations that came after were inspired by that coverage.
Which is phenomenal. I mean, it's one of those real, it's like flint and fire. It's just one can't happen without the other at that time. And you're in a situation with that where there's been certain eras of the sport or times. Over the Top's a massive example, isn't it? How many people can say, well, Over the Top, that was the spark. That's so many people came into the sport after watching Over the Top.
Right.
Huge influx of people. But
you speak to Marvin and Laurie, and they'll trace it back to WWC. So it all goes back to Petaluma.
And I'm sure it did, mate. I'm sure the spark for, to make the film came from that. I mean, because it was huge. The popularity of the Wide World of Sports thing was massive, wasn't it? I mean, it was achieving enormous viewing ratings. It's funny, arm wrestling's always done that.
Yep.
A little bit like the early UFC,
I remember. Go ahead, Eric.
No, go ahead, Bert.
I was going to say, I was fortunate enough in Erie, Pennsylvania, is my hometown here. I was fortunate enough that Apache Dan Carr, he brought arm wrestling to Erie, Pennsylvania, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to say he started having tournaments as early as like 1970, 71 in Erie. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's right about that.
Yeah,
and then I remember, and I remember being a young man with my mom at our shopping mall, and Dan was hosting a big arm wrestling tournament, and I was very young. I'm talking barely can remember, like 4 years old, young, and seeing that tournament being there and wanting to sit there and watch it. I was just mesmerized by all these big tough guys, as a little boy, seeing that. And so I was fortunate enough to, in Erie, grow up around arm wrestling because of Dan bringing it to, our hometown. So it got real big in the 70s here in Erie. And they weren't doing a straight-wristed style. Dan brought the hook.
Power
hook. Yeah. Yep, they were full turned all the way in, wrist to wrist, and it was a dog fight. And that's in fact, that was the first tournaments that anyone from Erie ever went to as a young kid.
Even in sort of when I started in the mid to late 80s, the powerlock tournaments were a thing.
Oh, really? Over there?
Oh,
too?
Yeah, right through to probably, when would it be, Bob? Mid 90s? Tony Stillette's gigs and stuff there were all powerlock starts, weren't they? Used to, we just had a high pad and you boom.
Yeah. Right. A lot less slips.
Yeah. The powerlock start were a thing. Never really particularly liked them.
It bangs up the elbow pretty good.
Right. And then Simon,
Steve Simons.
Stephen Simons from WPAA they never utilized the strap. If your hands came apart, then they just put you in a power hook, and you were not allowed to come out of the power hook. You had to stay in the power hook.
Boy, would hate that.
That would have pissed off fucking Taras, wouldn't it? Can you remember Taras would have been like, what the? You've just ruined my life.
Yeah. Cleve won a final one year against Bobby Hopkins for doing just that, and he was not happy. The 1984 WPAA Worlds, he came out of the power lock, and after being warned not to do it, he lost the final. Bobby Hopkins won, and Cleve, he was not happy.
Wow.
So here's a question for you, Eric. Who is, to the best of your knowledge, the oldest or earliest competitive arm wrestler who is still active today? Is there anybody who's right back to the 60s?
Crazy George told me that his first tournament was 1968. Now, I don't know that he competed straight through over the next 10 years. He has been competing definitely back to the 70s. He told me his first tournament was 1968. It was single elimination, single weight class. They would draw names to see what the matches would be out of a hat. Names would come out of the hat. All right, you pull you. So that's 50. And he's still pulling, so that's 52 years.
Yeah, I don't remember seeing George even in the late 80s. And
in Ontario, he was definitely active. He didn't travel as much, but he definitely did arm wrestle.
Does anybody have any stuff on Norm Devio, knowing when he started?
He started in 75, so he was already 35 in 75, but he's still pulling at 80.
Which is awesome.
Yeah, I knew Norm. The ironic story, the first time I met Norm Devio was in 1987. I was at a tournament in Taunton, Massachusetts, and they were handing out a birthday card that everyone, they were wanting to sign. And now no one, this is like my first time ever up there, no one knew who I was, and ironically, that was my birthday, and they're passing out this birthday card, and I couldn't figure out why. And I signed it, not even really knowing who it was for. It was for Norm Devio. We share the same birthday, and even in 1987, he was already a legend. So I knew that he had been arm wrestling since the 70s. I didn't know exactly when, so 75, thanks for that knowledge. That's very interesting.
And obviously Richard Lucas was on the Deep Inside series of the week, and he was, 70s again.
Right. The only other person that comes to mind, I don't know if he's still active though, is Steve Stanaway. He dates back to 67. And I know he has been competing. I just don't know if he's officially retired or he's competed for 50 years.
My understanding, I know he still refs, and there is some rumor that he might compete again.
Okay.
I haven't seen Steve in years.
Exactly. I haven't seen him in other than on video, because I know he's refed at the sit-down nationals in the last couple of years. I've just seen him on the internet.
And Steve, going back to what we were saying earlier, Steve was always that guy with the thick, just a thick looking dude, wasn't he? Good guy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the question on everybody's lips, bearing in mind that he laid the table at the Last Supper, Alan Fisher. When did Alan Fisher start? Because I have it on good authority that he was actually close personal friends with Jesus himself.
I believe it.
He started in 79.
1979.
Yeah.
And if you've ever seen the film Over the Top, which Alan is in, unmistakably, with the perm, amazing footage. Freddy Krueger t-shirt and a perm. Awesome. And Alan looks iron in that, doesn't he? Yeah, joking aside, Alan Fisher is a young man. Alan Fisher's a bad mother fluffer when he's old. Alan now is old as stone. I mean, he's like Pascal's dad. And Alan Fisher, if ever an individual has been designed to arm wrestling, comes out of the mother's, first thing out's a 15-inch forearm, and thou shall be an arm wrestler, my son. That dude found his calling. No doubt about it. Alan Fisher.
A prime example of the wrist that is just enormous for his body frame, and the elbow joint and hand, and the tendons that look like damn cables.
Can you imagine that kid at school throwing snowballs? Everybody else chucking snowballs about? It'd have been like he'd been hit with the midsection of the fucking snowman. When that guy threw a snowball at you, his hands are massive, aren't they?
Huge.
I mean, what a guy. What a character. But Alan's one of those guys that always used to have the claim, I'm 30-time world champion, because a lot of those must have been the Petaluma tournaments that he was winning.
At one point in the late 70s, early 80s, there were close to 10 organizations hosting world championships. So they add up.
Right.
Yeah. So it wasn't when was when the world championship started, and this is the classic. You speak to my old mate Engin, the Angry Terzi, okay, and I know he'll be watching this because it's got arm wrestling in the title. That's the guy, Engin. How you doing, sweethearts? Now, Engin will watch anything that's got arm wrestling in it, anything. He is one of the most knowledgeable people in arm wrestling that's ever existed. I'm going to say the most obsessed arm wrestler that's ever drawn breath is Engin Terzi. And what a fabulous arm wrestler that guy is. But one of Engin's comments has always been that back in the day, you couldn't really call it a world championship because there was no international competition. When did we first start to see evidence that there was? What was the first sort of real world championship or anything approaching that, mate?
I think most people recognize the 1979 WAF Worlds in Edmonton or Wetaskiwin, Alberta. 4 countries, so Canada, U.S., Brazil, and Japan, I think, was it? I think so. From there, that was probably the first one that had more than Canada and the U.S. Mm-hmm. And then from there it grew slowly until the late 80s. And the late 80s, early 90s when it really picked up steam and a lot of countries started joining WAF. Yeah. But I would say 1979 WAF World is sort of the one that's looked to as the first true world championship.
And was the dominant nation there the U.S.? As you would
U.S.
expect?
and Canada. U.S. and Canada. Yeah. But they had the lead up, they've been in arm wrestling for longer than all the other countries. It just gotten started in Brazil and Japan. Oh, sorry, India. India, Brazil, Canada, U.S. were the 4 countries.
And at what time did we start to see evidence of defined techniques, i.e. the top roll as we know it today?
So there was definitely techniques, even if you go back to the 1960s in Petaluma. People took it seriously. The best competitors took it seriously, and they trained and they would develop techniques, and they may not have had the names. Top roll itself, that term top roll, I think was originated by Rick Byers out of Texas, I think, around 78. The name top roll. Before that, it was more called over the top. Over the top, as in the movie. That was the term used for top roll in the mid 70s. Yep. But top rolling, that has been done at least till in the 1960s. Some people figured it out and they realized, hey, if I pull back, take the hand away.
And were most of the guys that originated the technique, were they what you'd expect, long-levered?
I'm not sure, but that's my impression. It's my impression.
Yeah. You expect so.
But definitely in the 70s, at least until the mid to late 70s, it was still recognized more as a strength game. So there were a lot more hookers. There was a lot less, there was almost no slips until around 77, 78, 79 is when the slips started happening. So, grips were fair. So if you speak to anyone who is an old timer, I've interviewed Jim Dole Sr., some of these people who won in the 60s and 70s, and they look at the sport, even by the late 70s, they had already lost interest because there's too much messing around for the grip. People aren't even trying to hold on. So these complaints have been around for a long time.
Any evidence of the first ever club, Eric?
I found evidence. So I'm not counting Japan, because Japan from the 1920s, they had a club going. In North America, the earliest I found were groups in New York State, Ohio, and that's probably mid-60s. Mm-hmm. Usually 3 or 4 guys getting together and trying to learn. But that's how far that goes back, as far as I've discovered.
When did you start, Bob?
Well, what I consider my first true organized tournament where you actually had to pay an entry fee and weigh in was 1987. I used to go since 1980. I used to go to a tournament that was held every year at the Philadelphia Fairground, and they didn't charge anything to enter. They just looked at you and said, oh, you're a lightweight, you're a middleweight, you're a heavyweight. And I started going to that in 1980, and I won that every year. So, of course, I still think I'm the greatest arm wrestler that's ever lived. And then I stumbled into a bowling alley in 86, I believe, or 87, and that's where I was like, okay, this is different. They're weighing you in, they're charging you money. This is different. And it was the only novice class I've ever entered, cause I didn't know what was going on, and I got second and had a very hard match for first. So I still think, I'm pretty good. And then about 3 months later, that same bowling alley had another tournament. They were run by Mike Mignona. These were AAA tournaments. He's out of New Jersey. And I decided to enter the open division. And that was the wake-up call that every new arm wrestler usually gets. Just got slammed by two guys, no idea who they were. And lo and behold, that year, the sit-down nationals was in Atlantic City, New Jersey. So I trained as hard as I could for that tournament, at least what I thought was training. Basically, I did a bunch of arm curls. Mm-hmm. I went down there and I got crushed. My first match was against the black guy who stuck his tongue out a lot.
Mr. Rhodes in the house.
Rhodes.
Yeah.
Of course, yes, it was Cobra. But then something very exciting happened to me at that tournament. I went to the side table and I arm wrestled with a guy who was in my class that I didn't know who he was, and he put me right down. And I just was like in awe. I'm like the guy who never lost, and now I can't win. And in 10 minutes, that guy said, use back pressure. And I didn't know what back pressure was. And he showed me. And in about 5 minutes, he taught me enough of a back pressure and a top roll to where I could beat him in 5 or 10 minutes. And I was like, oh, wow, there's a lot more to this sport than I had any idea about. And that led me down the path of technique and training. And I met Mike Mignona then, and there was a practice within 10 minutes of my house I didn't even know about. And that all started in 1987.
1987. So, Eric, where have we got it to, mate, as we draw a conclusion to this first, what's going to be an hour-long special, effectively, in the old school of arm wrestling? Where are we going to leave it for this episode, mate? We're up to what, 1960s, early 1960s? And we pick it up there next one?
Yeah, or 90s. Start with what came after Petaluma, because a lot happened in the 70s. So, yeah, I think we're done with the 60s.
Ladies and gentlemen, really hope you enjoyed this first episode of the Old School. I want to say thank you very much to my guests. Thank you to Bob Brown. Thank you to Bart Wood, the man in the stripes. And a massive thank you to Eric Roussin. Eric, one more time, tell people where they can go and see this stuff.
The Armwrestlingarchives.com is the website that has all the results and articles, but also the Arm Wrestling Archives Facebook page. I post a lot of little factoids almost on a daily basis.
And ladies and gents, if this is your first ever visit to Supernatural Strength, hope you like what we do here. If you do, please like, share, subscribe, let everybody know about it, have it tattooed somewhere on your body, and show everyone. Until that time, when we're next in the house with these three guys, I hope you and your family stay safe, and we'll see you again. Take it easy, peeps.